The first time Daniel Holloway saw Blackwood Asylum, he knew something was wrong with it. The building loomed against the storm-gray sky, its brick walls darkened by time and decay. Ivy snaked up the sides, swallowing entire windows, as if nature itself was trying to bury the place. The iron gates groaned as they swung open, welcoming him like a maw about to close. The year was 1952. Daniel wasn't supposed to be here. He had been a college student, a young man with his whole life ahead of him. But that life had been ripped away the moment he woke up in a hospital bed, his wrists bound by leather straps, the taste of metal and blood in his mouth. They told him he had suffered a breakdown, that he had attacked someone, that he was dangerous. He didn't remember any of it. The transfer to Blackwood had happened in a blur. Signatures were forged, a legal loophole was exploited, and suddenly, he was being led through the entrance hall by two burly orderlies. The moment the heavy doors slammed shut behind him, Daniel knew escape was no longer an option. Inside, the asylum was worse than he had imagined. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and mildew, the dim light flickering as if even electricity refused to stay too long. Patients shuffled through the halls, some muttering to themselves, others staring blankly ahead with dead eyes. And then there were the screams, muffled, distant, but constant, like the building itself was in pain. Dr. Aldrich was the first to greet him. A tall, skeletal man with sharp cheekbones and cold, calculating eyes, Dr. Aldrich studied Daniel like he was nothing more than a specimen under a microscope. "You've caused quite a bit of trouble," the doctor mused, flipping through a folder marked with Daniel's name. "Attacked a professor, broke a classmate's arm. My, such violence. Do you remember any of it?" Daniel swallowed hard. "No." Dr. Aldrich smiled, but it wasn't reassuring. It was the kind of smile a spider gives a fly before wrapping it in silk. "That's why you're here," he said. "To help you remember?" The room they assigned him was small and bare. A single cot, a tiny sink, and a barred window that faced the courtyard. The walls were lined with scratches, deep gouges in the paint that made his stomach churn. Someone had been here before him. Someone who had tried to get out. Daniel sat on the edge of the cot, his mind reeling. None of this made sense. He wasn't insane. He wasn't violent. Was he? That first night he barely slept. The screams in the halls never stopped. But something else kept him awake, the feeling that he wasn't alone. A whisper. Right by his ear. "You shouldn't be here." Daniel shot up, heart pounding. He flicked on the small bedside lamp, casting a dim glow around the room. Nothing. No one. His breath came fast and shallow. He tried to convince himself he imagined it. That it was a trick of his exhausted mind. Then he saw the words. Scratched into the floor beneath his bed, barely visible in the weak light. "It knows you're here." A chill crawled up his spine. His hands trembled as he reached down, tracing the letters with his fingertips. They were deep. Jagged. Made with desperation. Before he could react, something slammed against the wall behind him. A single, heavy knock. Then another. And then, from the other side of the wall, a voice, hoarse, trembling, filled with terror. "Don't let it in." Daniel pressed himself against the far corner of the room, his pulse racing. He could hear the heavy silence stretching between each knock. His fingers curled into the thin blanket, knuckles white with fear. Then the doorknob rattled. The breath hitched in his throat as the handle twisted. It stopped after a moment, but something still lingered outside, waiting. A shadow seeped beneath the crack of the door, long, tender-like, curling like smoke. He couldn't breathe. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but he was frozen, trapped in place by the sheer wrongness of what was happening. Finally, the presence at the door retreated. The knocking stopped. The shadows vanished. But as Daniel lay trembling in his bed, he realized one thing. This was only his first night. And Blackwood was just beginning to welcome him. Daniel sat frozen on the cot, his breath shallow, ears straining in the suffocating silence that followed the whisper. The voice on the other side of the wall, shaking, urgent, had warned him. But against what? He turned to the scratched message beneath his bed. "It knows you're here." A cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. Another knock, this time softer, more deliberate. Daniel swallowed hard. "Who's there?" he whispered. No answer. He slowly slid off the cot, his bare feet pressing against the icy floor. He hesitated before pressing his ear to the wall. The paint was cool, chipped away in places. He could hear nothing but his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. Then, scratching. Not the kind of idle scratching of rodents in the walls. This was different. A slow, deliberate dragging sound, as if something with long nails was carving into the surface just inches from his face. His stomach clenched. He jerked away. His door rattled. Daniel spun around, his pulse spiking. The doorknob jiggled once. Twice. Then silence. He held his breath, his mind racing. Maybe it was one of the orderlies making their rounds. Maybe it was just another patient, disoriented in the night. Or maybe it was either. A deep, guttural whisper slithered through the crack under his door. It wasn't words, not in any language Daniel understood. It was something else, something older. The air seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on his chest. The light flickered. The scratching on the wall stopped. The whispering faded. For several long minutes, Daniel remained rooted to the spot, staring at the door, waiting. When nothing happened, he forced himself to move, to climb back into bed. But he did not sleep. Morning arrived sluggishly. A dull gray light bled through the barred window, barely illuminating the room. Daniel sat up, his body stiff from a sleepless night. For a moment, he almost believed it had been a nightmare. Almost. A sharp knock at his door startled him. It was different from the ones last night, precise, measured. Dr. Aldrich stepped inside, flanked by two orderlies. "Good morning, Daniel," the doctor said, his voice calm and clinical. "How did you sleep?" Daniel hesitated. He considered telling them what had happened, about the voice, the scratches, the whispering. But something inside him, instinct maybe, told him not to. He forced a tight-lipped smile. "Fine." Dr. Aldrich studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. It's important that you remain calm during your stay here." Daniel barely listened. His eyes had drifted past the doctor, past the orderlies, to the hallway beyond. A patient stood there. Pale, gaunt, with sunken eyes wide with terror. He was staring straight at Daniel. His lips trembled, mouthing silent words over and over. Daniel read them. "It's watching you." Then, as if ripped away by unseen hands, the patient disappeared. Daniel's breath itched. "Who was that?" he asked. Dr. Aldrich didn't even turn to look. "No one important." The doctor motioned for the orderlies. "Prepare Mr. Holloway for today's session. I believe we should begin treatment immediately." The treatment room was small and clinical, filled with the scent of disinfectant. The chair in the center had thick leather straps. Daniel's stomach turned. "You've suffered severe delusions, Daniel," Dr. Aldrich said as the orderlies strapped him down. "These treatments will help correct your mind." Daniel struggled against the restraints. "I'm not delusional." Aldrich simply nodded to the technician, who flipped a switch. Pain tore through Daniel's skull as electricity surged through him. His vision blurred, his body convulsing against the chair. And in the darkness of his mind, something stirred. A whisper. Familiar. Echoing. I see you. And then, a pair of eyes, hollow and endless, staring right into his soul. When he awoke, he was back in his room. The world felt distant, sluggish, as if he were swimming through molasses. He sat up slowly, his head pounding. Something was different. The scratches beneath the bed had changed. It's closer now. A shadow flickered in the corner of his vision. Daniel turned sharply, but the room was empty. His breathing grew rapid, his chest tight. He forced himself to his feet, his legs weak beneath him. He needed to think. To understand. To escape. Then a knock at the door. Soft. Patient. He backed away, his pulse thundering in his ears. The knock came again. And then, a voice. Deep, distorted, unnatural. Let me in. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. You're not real. You're not real. The door creaked, opening just an inch. A sliver of darkness spilled into the room, writhing like tendrils of ink in water. And then the whisper returned, filling the space around him, pressing against his skull. I see you. The knock at the door came again. Soft. Patient. Daniel pressed his back against the wall, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The room felt smaller, the air pressing against him. The door creaked, shifting slightly as if whatever was on the other side was waiting for an invitation. Then a voice. Deep. Distorted. Let me in. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. You're not real, he whispered. You're not real. The silence that followed was worse than the whisper. The air felt heavy, charged. And then the door creaked again, just a sliver. A sliver of darkness spilled into the room, writhing like ink in water. His pulse hammered. He wanted to run, to scream, but his limbs refused to move. He forced himself to look. Nothing. The hallway outside was empty. Daniel remained frozen for a long moment before pushing himself up, his legs trembling beneath him. The door was open just a crack, but the hall beyond was eerily silent. A voice rasped in his mind, crawling along his spine. It's inside now. A shudder tore through him as he backed away. The room felt wrong. It's closer now. The words scratched into the floor seemed deeper, like something had been etching them from beneath. His mind screamed for logic, for reason, but Blackwood offered neither. The sharp, precise knock at the door shattered the silence again. Daniel barely had time to react before the door swung open, revealing Dr. Aldrich flanked by two towering orderlies. The doctor's eyes gleamed with clinical detachment, his thin lips curling in a calculated smile. How are we feeling today, Daniel? Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. He hesitated, glancing past Aldrich into the hallway. Empty. Hadn't he just seen? Aldrich tilted his head slightly. No response? He motioned to the orderlies. Escort Mr. Holloway to room 17. We'll continue treatment immediately. Daniel's breath itched. No. The orderlies advanced, their grips vice-like as they wrenched him from his cot. He struggled, but it was useless. No! Please! You have to listen to me! The last thing he saw before they dragged him into the hallway was the scratched message on the floor. Don't open the door. Room 17 was colder than before. The overhead light buzzed, flickering intermittently. The chair with its thick leather restraints loomed in the center of the room, waiting. Dr. Aldrich adjusted the dials on the control panel. You claim there's been a mistake, he mused. That you don't belong here. That something is watching you. Daniel's chest heaved. It's real. I don't know what it is, but it's real. Aldrich tilted his head slightly, as if analyzing a lab specimen. Then let's see if we can make it show itself. He nodded to the technician. The switch flipped. Pain. Blinding, unbearable pain. Electricity surged through Daniel's skull, lighting up his nerves like fire. He arched against the restraints, his screams echoing off the sterile walls. Darkness exploded behind his eyelids, shapes twisting and writhing in the abyss of his mind. Then, a figure. Not human. Not fully formed. A shifting void of stretched skin and hollow eyes. Daniel saw himself standing in front of a door. A door he had never seen before. His hand moved, reaching for the handle, but something grabbed his wrist. The whisper came again, but this time, it wasn't from outside. It was inside him. You let me in. The world snapped back into focus. Daniel gasped, collapsing against the chair. The restraints had been undone. The room was empty. No orderlies. No Aldrich. Just silence. He stumbled to his feet, his legs shaking. The air in the room had changed, thicker, pressing in on him from all sides. His pulse pounded in his ears as he turned toward the door, half expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. Slowly, cautiously, he pushed it open. The hallway beyond was abandoned. Lights flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows along the walls. The patients' doors hung ajar, their rooms empty. Daniel swallowed hard, stepping forward. Then he saw the first body. One of the orderlies lay slumped against the wall, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. His throat had been torn open, blood pooling around his limp form. Daniel's stomach churned as he stumbled backward. A whisper slithered through the air. Run! Daniel obeyed. He sprinted down the corridor, the world tilting around him. Doors slammed shut as he passed, as if something unseen was hurting him forward. He turned a corner, nearly colliding with a figure standing in the middle of the hall. Daniel froze, his breath caught in his throat. The air around him grew frigid, his limbs locking in place. A presence loomed ahead, not quite visible, but he could feel it, watching, waiting. Then, the whisper came again, curling around his thoughts like smoke. It's inside you now. Daniel barely had time to react before darkness swallowed him whole. Daniel's mind swam in the void, untethered, drifting through endless darkness. The whisper still echoed in his head. It's inside you now. Then, sensation returned. Cold. Damp. The floor pressed against his cheek, rough and cracked. He forced his eyes open. He was still in Blackwood. The corridor stretched before him, but it was wrong. The walls pulsed as if breathing, the ceiling above twisted at impossible angles. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows that stretched too far. A metallic scent filled the air. Blood. Daniel pushed himself to his knees, his limbs trembling. His hospital gown clung to his damp skin. He turned his head slowly. The orderly's body was still there, slumped against the wall, his lifeless eyes frozen in terror. But something had changed. The shadows near the corpse weren't right. They shifted. Daniel's pulse roared in his ears. He scrambled backward, his hands slipping on the slick tiles. A shape emerged from the darkness. Not walking. Not crawling. Flowing. It had no definite form, only jagged edges that flickered like static, a hole in the fabric of reality. But the eyes, empty voids, shifting, staring, they saw him. Then it moved. Daniel spun and ran. His feet barely made a sound as he sprinted down the endless corridor. Doors whipped past him, each one slightly ajar, revealing brief flashes of impossible things. Twisted faces grinning from the dark, hands reaching out from mirrors, patients curled in corners whispering his name. His legs burned. The hall stretched longer and longer, the end always just out of reach. The lights above flickered wildly. Then silence. Daniel stopped. The hallway had changed. The doors were gone. The lights had dimmed to a sickly red glow. The air smelled of decay, thick and stagnant. A distant hum vibrated beneath his feet. He turned. The thing was there, just beyond the shadows, waiting. It didn't move. It didn't have to. It had already won. A new voice slithered into Daniel's thoughts, deeper, colder. You opened the door. Daniel clutched his head. No, he whispered. I didn't. Images flooded his mind. Flashes of memories that weren't his. A door at the end of a hallway, rusted, ancient. His hand reaching for the handle. A voice urging him forward. The door creaking open. Darkness spilling through. Daniel gasped. His body convulsed as the realization hit him like ice water. He had let it in. Terror seized him. He stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The thing in the dark shifted, its form glitching in and out of existence, closer now. The walls trembled. The ground cracked beneath his feet. Then the lights snapped off. Total darkness. A breath, slow and deliberate, right next to his ear. You are mine! Daniel screamed. When he woke, the world had changed again. He was strapped down. Leather restraints dug into his wrists and ankles. His body ached, his throat raw from screaming. The room was small, the walls stark white. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above him. Dr. Aldrich sat nearby, scribbling notes on a clipboard. Welcome back, Daniel, the doctor said without looking up. That was quite the episode. Daniel's breathing was ragged. What? Where am I? Aldrich finally met his gaze, his expression unreadable. You're in Blackwood, as always. You had another break. But don't worry, he said with a small smile. We're making progress. Daniel's mind reeled. Had any of it been real? The shadows, the whispers, the thing hunting him, had it all been a delusion? Then he noticed his arms. His veins were black. Faint, inky tendrils curled beneath his skin like living things. Aldrich followed his gaze and nodded approvingly. Yes. That's new. Daniel's stomach dropped. He thrashed against the restraints, pure panic surging through him. Get it out of me! Get it out! Aldrich simply made another note on his clipboard. It's far too late for that. The hum of the lights deepened, turning into a whisper. A familiar voice curling around his thoughts. We are one now! Daniel screamed again, but this time, it wasn't just his voice. It was theirs. Daniel's screams faded into the sterile hum of Blackwood Asylum. The weight of something foreign coiled inside him, seeping through his veins, whispering in his mind. He could feel it, pressing against his ribs, his lungs, wrapping itself around his very thoughts. Dr. Aldrich watched him with cold curiosity, jotting notes onto his clipboard. Fascinating, he murmured. The integration is progressing much faster than expected. Daniel writhed against the restraints. His body no longer felt like his own. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, bending unnaturally, stretching toward him. He tried to scream again, but his voice was not his own. We are awake! Aldrich's lips curled into something resembling a smile. Yes, he said, leaning forward. You are. The whispers filled Daniel's skull, a chorus of voices speaking in languages he didn't understand. His body convulsed, his bones aching under the pressure of something shifting beneath his skin. The restraints creaked as he strained against them, but Aldrich didn't flinch. Tell me, Daniel, the doctor mused, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "What does it feel like?" Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps. His fingers twitched involuntarily, his hands curling into unnatural shapes. His own voice finally returned, weak, trembling. "Please," he whispered. "Make it stop." Aldrich sighed. "That's not how this works." He stood, moving toward the door. "You invited it in, Daniel. You opened the door. There's no going back now." The lights flickered. The shadows in the room deepened. Something moved within them. It was watching. Daniel's restraints snapped open. He fell forward, barely catching himself before hitting the ground. His limbs felt wrong, too long, too thin. The thing inside him pulsed, its presence pressing against his mind like a second consciousness. The door swung open on its own. Aldrich stepped aside, gesturing toward the empty hallway. "Go on, then." Daniel hesitated. He knew what awaited him beyond that door. He could feel it, stretching through the corridors, filling every crack in the walls, watching through every flickering light. His pulse pounded. Then, the whisper came again, slithering through his mind like silk. "Come home." His feet moved before he could stop them. He stepped through the door. The asylum had changed. The walls pulsed like living flesh, veins of darkness spiderwebbing across the ceiling. The lights overhead no longer flickered, they glowed with an eerie red hue, casting long, twisting shadows. The air was thick, humming with something unnatural. Daniel walked forward, his bare feet soundless against the floor. The voices in his head were louder now, speaking over one another in an endless, chaotic symphony. And then, he saw them. Figures lined the hallway, standing in open doorways. Patients. Orderlies. Some faces he recognized, others he didn't. Their eyes were black voids, their lips curled into silent smiles. They watched him, unblinking. Waiting. Aldrich's voice drifted from behind him. "You were never a patient, Daniel. You were the key." Daniel's breathing hitched. He turned, but the doctor was gone. The hallway stretched endlessly now, the figures closing in, their mouths moving without sound. He wanted to run, to scream, to fight, but it was too late. The thing inside him whispered again, the words wrapping around his mind like chains. "It's time." Daniel took another step forward. And then, he smiled. Blackwood Asylum was found abandoned a week later. No patients. No staff. Every room left exactly as it was, as if frozen in time. But the walls were different. Etched into every surface, deep into the concrete, were the same three words. "It let me in."